Good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me pretty well? This has been a real pleasure to be here in Jerusalem, and of course I want to thank the organizers, not just for creating a great meeting, but also for a great atmosphere and the wonderful opportunities we've had to explore Jerusalem. And given that the topic of this conference is what makes us human, I find it a bit surprising that it's left to me on the third day to give what I think is the obvious answer to that question, which is language. I think that is the key cognitive ability of our species, much more than walking upright or having good hands or all the other things we can do, because language is what makes possible the cumulative culture that really makes our species different from every other. That's why we're flying in airplanes and going to the moon. And language is a crucial underpinning of culture. Now, of course, what we spent most of the first 2 days talking about is the brain, and the question of what about human brains gives us language is a central part of this question. But I think the cognitive phenotype that makes us humans, I want to argue, is language. And just as one little example of this is a nice study, recent study by Kevin Leyland's group, looking at information transfer. So basically, the task is to make stone tools, like from one whiteboards, to make flakes. And you have expert tool users who are interacting with novices in these different conditions, one of which the novices, just in the reverse engineering, they just see a stone flake and they try and make it. And these guys are terrible. Then they watch an experienced maker, that's emulation, some basic teaching where the teacher can do things like point or grunt, and gestural teaching where they can do that, but they still can't use language. And finally, they're allowed to say things like, you've got to hit it right here to knock that chip off just right to get a sharp chip. And if you look at the success of the novices, they're much, much better, significantly better when the teachers were allowed to use it. And I think that's one of many examples that shows that the kind of cumulative culture that really makes us special among the species would not be as well developed as it is if we didn't have language. So the topic of this first session is the language instinct. And I want to say that I don't think what gives us language is an instinct. None of us are born speaking English or Hebrew or any other language. It's not an instinct in the same way that the knee-jerk reflex is. What we have is an instinct to learn language. And I think as soon as you let this term instinct to learn sink in, it allows us to bypass a whole lot of unproductive 100 years of discussion about nature versus nurture, etc. Language is thoroughly nurture in the sense that we have to learn our local languages, and every child does. But it's also very much part of our nature as humans. Every child is born with this capacity to absorb the language or languages of their environment and become an adult language user. So the instinct to learn language is what we want to, that's what we're trying to understand when we do the biology and evolution of language. And of course, in this field, there's a very long-running polarity, tradition of argument between two opposite sides. One is Darwin, who stressed the commonalities that we have with other species. So Darwin loved to say how much apes were like us or how much other species were like us. He pointed out that birdsong is a nice model of human language. So Darwin stressed the commonalities and stressed the continuity of evolution. And on the other hand, Noam Chomsky, for pretty much his whole career, has stressed the differences, stressed what makes language unique compared to the communication systems of other animals. And I actually think that I mean, it's not surprising that both of these giants, intellectual giants, are correct. It just depends on what we're talking about. So a lot of my research has been essentially trying to build bridges between these two seemingly opposing viewpoints and recognize the fact that, in fact, there are shared components and there are special components. And I was lucky enough to work with Noam Chomsky writing a couple of papers trying to start building these bridges between these different viewpoints. So let me start by saying what I mean by language. And I think it's very important to point out that all animals communicate, not just the sort of familiar examples of dogs barking or vervet monkeys with their different alarm calls for different types of predators, but even single-cell organisms like amoeba communicate via chemical signals. The famous honeybee dance language is a nice example where they communicate via these little dances, the location of flowers and other goodies. So all of these different species have communication systems. but I would not call them, even though people talk about verbal language or being language, I've never heard people talk about amoeba language, but in principle you could call these all languages. But I think that's confusing because the difference between language and these other communication systems is that language lets us talk about anything we know. And we know, for example, that honeybees know a lot that they can't communicate. So they know about colors of flowers, they know concepts like same and different, but an individual honeybee has no way, using the communication system that they've evolved, to communicate that kind of knowledge to others. So they're limited, their thoughts are bigger than what they can say. And what makes language special is that we can essentially take any concept that we have in our head, and through this complicated spaghetti of phonology, phonetics, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, etc., we can map that onto a signal, and then another speaker of our language can take that signal and map it back to the concept. It's not always perfect. Sometimes it takes some trial and error, but we can do that. We can talk about things like supernovae and octopus mating habits and the construction of the body through developmental time, et cetera, et cetera. We can do all that. And no other animal, as far as we know, has that capability. So all I mean by language is a system that allows us to encode and communicate anything that we can think, any of our thoughts, and share that information with others. And I think, well, as far as we know, no other species on the planet has that capacity. They can communicate, but they don't have language in this sense. So that's an open, we might still find out that there's a species with language. We might find an alien species that has language. This is an open definition, but based on what we know today, this is something that only our species has. Okay, so I think the crucial first step in understanding the biology and evolution of language is to divide this, what seems like one thing to us, our language, to divide it up into its component parts. And there's a lot of them. I think there are many different cognitive and neural mechanisms that underlie language, things like speech perception. This is something that seems to be broadly shared with other species. Phonology, we're not so sure about. Hierarchical syntax seems to be pretty special in our species. Conceptual structures, at least at a basic level, are shared. All of these different components add up to give us language. And I think as soon as we start dividing language into these components, we can start to dissolve this controversy between is language shared or is it unique. And so the way I like to think of language is as an edifice that's built on a lot of shared commonality. There's a lot of our biology and a lot of our cognition that we share with other species, but there's a few things that make language different. And what we're trying to do is figure out what those things are. Okay, so for any comparative biologist, there's essentially the main tool that we use in trying to understand biology, and particularly in understanding evolution, is the comparative method. And there's essentially two ways that we can find similarities out there in the natural world. Two different types of similarities that where we share something with other species. And the one that's most obvious is called homology. This is when, for example, we and our nearest relatives, the great apes, share many capabilities in common. We're relatively large, relatively long-lived, we have long childhoods, we have big brains, we're good with our hands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason we share those traits in common is because our common ancestor with the other great apes shared all those commonalities. And from a statistical point of view, what that means is that there was an event, an evolutionary event, a single event that led to, for example, the evolution of manual dexterity. And the three species that I've graphed here that show that capability are not independent data points. And that's a problem if we're trying to test hypotheses, because the N here, even if we had hundreds of species, the N is really one. There's an evolutionary event that led to a lot of species. These are all correlated traits. And the reason that's important is because it shows us why the other kind of similarity is so useful. So this is called convergent evolution, where we find similarities between us and distant relatives. Like birds, I'm walking around on 2 feet. Birds also walk around on 2 feet. And we know that that trait of bipedalism independently evolved in our lineage and in the birds. We know that partly because of fossils, but we also know that because all these species in the middle don't walk around on 2 feet. So we can infer that our common ancestor with birds walked on 4 feet, and we've independently evolved that. And what that means from a hypothesis testing point of view is that these are independent data points. So we can really count this as these are separate evolutionary events. We can count those as separate bits of evidence for or against a particular hypothesis about, say, why bipedalism evolved. Okay, so to sum this up, this is this picture of language that I want you to walk away with. The idea is that a lot of our biology is shared, a lot of our cognition is shared. I'm not going to read the whole list out, but these are all things that we have good evidence from work in animal cognition that we share with other species. But there's a few things built on top of this shared foundation. There's a few things that make us special, and together, working together, give us language. And I call these the 3 S's: signaling, so that are speech, syntax, and semantics. Each of these, if we compare ourselves with chimpanzees, are weird things about our species, things that make humans unusual in the animal world, and certainly relative to chimpanzees, unique. And what I want to do is talk about signal and syntax. I won't have time to talk about semantics today. The reason is that the reason I choose signal and syntax is these are places where we have very clear hypotheses about what the neural differences are that underlie these two weird capabilities. So sometime in the last 6 million years, we evolved independently of chimpanzees the capacity for signaling, for complex signaling via our vocal tract, and for syntax. And what I want to do in the rest of this talk is try and walk you through how we can study that from a comparative point of view, using using homology and analogy to try and understand the biology and evolution of these. Okay, so the rest of the talk is basically going to be, first I'll talk about speech. I want to go relatively quickly through this because I think this is a place where the answers are, in a sense, pretty well known. There's still argument, of course, but I think this is a place where you can pick up papers and read the answer. The second part about syntax is much more controversial, but I think we've made good progress in understanding it. And I'll end with a hypothesis about the neural mechanisms that underlie syntax, which I call the dendrophilia hypothesis. So starting with speech, if we compare ourselves with the other great apes, and this has now been done in many different households at many different times, if you bring a young chimpanzee into a human home and raise it like a child, sometimes alongside with another child, this has been done many times, and in all cases, chimpanzees can learn to do a lot. This is a little chimp named Vicky, who could drive a car. She could help wash the dishes. She could tie her shoes. So really quite sophisticated imitative abilities. But one thing that none of these apes raised in human homes have ever done is learn how to speak even the most basic phrases like, hello, how are you, or anything like that. Boker tov. No ape has ever said those words, okay? Even with intensive training, Vicky could only make a few very rough approximations of words like cup, where she'd say, hup, and mama, where she'd say, hup. Something you would not even understand. And that was with intensive training over years, feeding her a grape every time she came even close. Okay? So this is a striking difference between any human baby by the time they're about 8 months old is already imitating the sounds of their environment. And by the time they're 1 year old, they're making all kinds of, they're starting to make their basic understandable words in whatever their native language is. Okay? So I think this is a core fact that we know apes can't do this, and we want to know why. And there have been 2 traditional hypotheses about why, what is the difference. And the first one, it's not quite so clear here, but these red lines represent the location of the larynx, of the voice box in the throat. And in human beings, the larynx has descended in the throat, pulling the tongue back with it. We've known about that for 150 years. This anatomy is pretty obvious if you dissect a human and a chimpanzee. And a long-running hypothesis has been that that change in vocal anatomy is what gives us humans the capacity for speech and prevents chimpanzees from doing it. Now, the other hypothesis, and this goes back to Darwin and before, is that, well, this matters in the sense that you have to produce sounds, but what really matters is having the control over those sounds, and that's a factor of the nervous system. So let's take these 2 traditional hypotheses and dissect them and use the comparative approach to try and test these among these 2 hypotheses. So starting with the peripheral hypothesis, the vocal anatomy hypothesis, one of the first things, this data here is based on dead animals. So this is looking at a dead chimpanzee, and one of the first questions I asked when I came into this field was, what do animals actually do when they vocalize? And what I'm going to show you now is an X-ray video of a dog. This is the jaw of the dog, this is the throat of the dog, and what you're going to see here is the larynx while the dog barks. It's been slowed down, and what you'll see is that the larynx descends into a human-like position every time the dog produces a bark. So there's the larynx. Watch it. So it pulls down, pulling the tongue with it, basically putting the dog into a human-like position. Every time every dog barks, we've looked now in many different individuals, the same thing happens. Okay? So dogs can flexibly put, and dogs and all the other mammals we've looked at, can flexibly put their vocal tract into a human-like configuration. They just only do it when they're making a vocalization. Humans tend to leave it in this configuration even if we're not talking. Okay? So this descent of the larynx is something that we see in all the mammals we've looked at. And the date on this is 2000. So I did this work back in 2000, and I was already convinced that this peripheral anatomy didn't play a crucial role in our speech capacity based on these data. But my thesis supervisor, who came up with this idea about the vocal tract position being so important, wasn't convinced. And he kept being unconvinced. So we finally decided to do what I hope is the definitive study on this. And this is with my colleagues Asif Ghazenfar at Princeton and Bart de Boer in Amsterdam. And what we did is we took macaques, rhesus macaques, and we had them in an X-ray system where we looked at what they did with their larynx when they vocalized, when they chewed, when they made communicative gestures like smiling or lip smacks. So all of the different things that an awake macaque can do with his vocal tract, we documented. So I'll just show you one of these videos to give you a sense. This is the macaque making a little grunt. And you can see that the larynx drops in the same way that the dog larynx drops. The macaque drops its larynx when it produces these sounds. But then rather than just stopping here, we then traced the vocal tract anatomy of the monkeys, and we used those tracings to make a 3D computer model of the vocal tract based on all of the actual, on the movements of the vocal tract that we actually saw. So we just took 100 samples of divergent vocal tract shapes, and we used that to make a computer model. And once you have the computer model, it's very easy to pull out the formant frequencies, which are the crucial things for the crucial acoustic cues for speech. And what we found was quite striking. So what I'm showing here in red is a human female's vowel triangle or vowel outline. This is the first formant against the second formant. Those are the two crucial acoustic cues that distinguish between vowels like e, a, e, and u. And inside are the old estimates from Philip Lieberman's work in the 1960s of what a monkey could do. Those were based on a dead animal. Those were based on estimates of looking at just a dead monkey. What we now did was look at a living monkey, and what we found is that the vocal tract space, the space of possible vowels of a macaque, are much, much larger, basically the same size, a little bit smaller, but not much, as this red outline of a human female. And we also took the most divergent vowels from this monkey vowel space, and we did a series of discrimination experiments, and we showed that those are very clearly discriminable. But that, of course, is kind of a boring way of saying what we really want to say. Could a monkey talk? Given the actual observed vocal tract configurations, would a monkey be able to speak? And so what I'm going to play you now are examples using our computer synthesizer. So what I've done now is take my wife saying, "Will you marry me?" Take her formant frequencies, using a monkey source. So I'm going to resynthesize my wife with a monkey's larynx, so you'll hear that first. And then we take the nearest formant tracks that our monkey computer model could produce. And so see if you can understand that. So here's the first example. My wife with a monkey. She doesn't mind this, I asked, don't worry. That's strange. Suddenly we're not hearing any sound. Uh-oh. What happened with the HDMI sound, guys? Hello? Not getting any sound?
Will you marry me?
Thank you. Okay. So, obviously intelligible. You can hear what she's saying.
Will you marry me?
Even though we're using a monkey larynx a modeled monkey larynx to. Now, here we go. Here's the crucial part. Here's the closest a monkey vocal tract could come to producing those same sounds.
Will you marry me? Will you marry me?
Okay. It's not quite as intelligible. It sounds a little weird, a little creepy, I must say. But clearly, the vowel space is enough that if a monkey had the requisite neural control, it could produce understandable speech. Okay? I'm not arguing that there aren't some tweaks to our vocal tract that might make us a little better at this, but the idea that the reason a non-human primate can't talk at all is because of the vocal tract, I think, is disproved by this work. So that leaves us, if we can exclude the vocal anatomy as a crucial thing, that leaves us with the brain, and as we've learned in the last 2 days, the brain is a very big place. There's a lot of differences between a human brain and an ape brain that might potentially be responsible for this additional neural control that we have. But a pretty old hypothesis, and I think a pretty convincing hypothesis, goes back to the work of Kuipers and more recently by Uwe Jürgens. The hypothesis is as follows. In most mammals, the connections between the cortex, the motor cortex that is involved in vocalization, and the actual motor neurons that control the voice is indirect. So this is a monkey, but you find, this is a cat, but you find the same thing in a monkey or a chimpanzee. The motor cortical connections go through interneurons in the brainstem, and then those interneurons are the ones that actually send the signals that controls the vocalization. That's the case in all mammals. We still retain those ancient connections, so that's a homology, and that's what's used for things like laughter and crying in humans. But in addition, humans have evolved these extra connections, and these are called direct corticomotor connections, straight from the motor neurons in the laryngeal motor cortex down onto the motor neurons that control the actual muscle twitches. Okay? So we seem to be able to bypass this ancestral system with these novel additional connections. And that's always made sense to me because if you want to imitate sounds in the environment, as we can do, you need a way of connecting your auditory cortex to the motor cortex that would actually control the voice. If you don't have that, you aren't going to be able to imitate sounds in the environment. So I think it's a very plausible hypothesis, but it's basically one of these N of 1 examples. We have humans have these, other animals don't. No other primate, they've looked at a lot, has these direct connections. So how can we actually test a hypothesis like that? An N of 1 is not enough. And this is where the convergent evolution becomes crucial, because we have many other species on the planet, fortunately, that are able to imitate sounds in their environment. Naturally, what all of these species use that for is learning sounds from their conspecifics, but in quite a few cases, they can also learn sounds like human speech. And I just want to give you 2 examples. This one's for Giorgio. This is an Italian-speaking myna bird that I met in Ticino. And this bird was in a bar. I walked in, and he says, "Buonasera." Well, and I'll show it for you. So you'll hear me in the background trying to get him going. He does a bunch of myna stuff first, but then he'll switch to Italian.
Buonasera. Come stai? Come stai?
Come stai?
Buonasera.
Buonasera, buonasera, buonasera.
He speaks better Italian than me. Yes, thank you, Giorgio. I appreciate that. But think how striking that is. A chimpanzee, our nearest living relative, even with intensive training, can't even say mama. Stick a myna in the corner of a bar, and he picks up Italian better than me. So that's a striking difference, and that's clearly convergent evolution. Here's another example. This is a harbor seal named Hoover. His mother died in childbirth. He was born into the arms of a fisherman who brought him home in Maine, in the northeast of the United States. They called him Hoover because he ate so much. So they put him in the bathtub. They raised him for a few months. And then finally, when he got too big, they donated Hoover to the New England Aquarium, where when he became sexually mature, so several years after this intensive experience, he began to make the sounds that I'm going to play. And he was directing these at female seals, just in case you're wondering. So he can say his name. Well, you'll hear. So what's clear is Hoover, hey, 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 get over here. He's saying get over here. It's not particularly clear if you're not a native English speaker. He got a little bit better as he aged, so this is a bit later in his life.
Hey, hey, get over here, hey, hey.
So again, not only is this seal speaking English after a few months in a bathtub of a fisherman, but he actually has a pretty nice Maine fisherman's accent, kind of after a couple Budweisers. That's what he sounds like, okay? So these are just 2 examples. We have many examples now of other species, distant relatives of us, who have learned to imitate speech. And when we take all of these species together, we have a nice sample size of independent data points that allows us to test this direct connections hypothesis. So the prediction is, if it's the case that what you need to imitate speech, or imitate sounds, is direct connections from your motor cortex to your larynx, or to the laryngeal motor neurons, all of these species should have them, and other species that can't imitate sounds should lack those connections. Okay? Clear prediction. It's clearly an empirical question, Right now we have data from 3 different avian vocal learning groups, the parrots, the songbirds, and the hummingbirds, and in all of these 3 cases, the prediction is upheld. So all of these species show direct connections, and none of their relatives who can't imitate speech, so chickens or owls or other birds who aren't able to imitate sounds, have these direct connections. Now in birds, the connections, they don't have a cortex, so you have to make a few adjustments, but it comes from the equivalent of motor cortex in the bird down onto the motor neurons that control the syringeal organ which makes the sounds. Okay? So I think this is a strong hypothesis. What I've shown you is how we can test it. There's other species, and I know that at least one species of bat, this hasn't been published yet, but there's new data suggesting that the vocal learners also have direct connections. We should be able to find this out in seals, maybe in dolphins, probably never in elephants, but we have the sample size in principle to test this hypothesis. So my conclusion from all this about speech is that the comparative biology, if we look at living animals rather than extrapolating from fossils or from dead specimens, gives us a very powerful tool, both to generate hypotheses, but also to test them using convergent evolution. Okay, but a lot of you are probably thinking, well, that's speech, and we know that speech is not crucial for language. We all write every day, write and read, and we're not using speech for that. And more importantly, there are varieties of language, like signed language, which don't use speech at all. They use a totally different output. But what everyone will agree is central to language is syntax. Without being able to put multiple words together into hierarchical structures, we wouldn't be able to communicate arbitrary thoughts the way we do. So and you'll notice that I've actually put some music here, and I'll get to the reason for that at the last part of the talk. But there is probably no linguist in the world who wouldn't agree that syntax plays a crucial role in the capacity of language to express anything that we can think. So again, we can play the same game. We can ask, well, how do we compare to our nearest living relatives, the chimpanzees or the other great apes? And what I'm sure many of you are aware, although chimps can't speak and gorillas can't either, they can learn to use their hands to communicate, and they have a much richer ability to communicate via hand signs or keyboards than they do with their vocalizations. Probably the star of this story is Kanzi, who's a bonobo who has learned to communicate both using gesture and using the keyboard, which has hundreds of unique signs that Kanzi understands. And Kanzi uses that he combines those in a very simple syntax. So he'll do things like gesture to say gimme and then point at grape, or gesture and point at apple. And he can use that in a very structured way to make specific requests. So it's a simple syntax, but it doesn't go beyond the level of, say, a 2-year-old child. So it's not that apes don't have any syntax. It's that they don't have the same complexity of syntax as we do. And what's missing from that, again, any linguist will agree with this, is the capacity to build up hierarchical structures, arbitrary hierarchical structures. So this is just a little test to make sure everybody's awake and had their coffee. If you see a sentence like this, the boy who kicked the dog chased the girl. And I ask you, who chased the girl? Now, if you speak English and you're awake and you're a human, you're going to say it's the boy, right? But think about Kanzi looking at the same sentence. He would say, look, it says right there, the dog chased the girl. That sentence is there. How can you tell me, why should it be the boy? The boy is further away from the girl than the dog is. Right? And obviously, we don't think that way. Humans don't think this way. No one has to teach a child to think in terms of these hierarchical structures. But what we do almost automatically as humans is we lump this together into one little phrase. We interpret this phrase as modifying the boy, and we can still see that despite their distance in the string, it's the boy and the girl who are closely related. So this kind of hierarchical structure, since the 1950s, has been seen as a crucial part of syntax. So basically building up tree structures from strings of words, not just looking at the string of words, but looking at the structure. So how can we make sense of that? The tool that we've been using for the last 10, 15 years in my lab is called the formal language hierarchy. This is a body of mathematical theorems, and it's mostly used in computer science today. It started with Turing, who outlined the outermost part of this circle, and then Noam Chomsky added several sort of intermediate zones. I don't have time to go into all the details of what this means, but what matters is that it's a very clear, formalized body of mathematics that you can use to construct stimuli and build experiments that can test the question of how complex is the syntax of some other species. What we know from lots of work in comparative linguistics is that human languages are out here, sort of on the edge, just a bit beyond the edge of this next more complex level than this. So what we're going to ask is, we have lots of evidence that animals are at this level, that they can deal with very simple syntax, putting 2 and 2 together. The question is whether they can go beyond this into the so-called, these are called regular grammars, and these are called supraregular grammars. Okay, and we know humans can do this. The question is, what about other animals? Now, this seems like a very abstract mathematical way of approaching this question. How do we do this practically? Well, the first thing we do is come up with different grammars that are at different parts of that space, of that hierarchy. And the 2 grammars that sort of started off this field are a simple grammar, a finite state grammar that only uses sequence, and that grammar, we call it AB to the n because it means repeat AB as many times as you want. AB, 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 AB. All of those are good strings in this particular grammar. And in principle, it's infinite. You can have as many strings of AB as you want, and we have different strings, so we have different A's and B's. So it's reasonably complex. It's not trivial that an animal would be able to learn that. Our next grammar, and this is the more interesting one, is one where the number of A's and B's must match. So we call it A to the n, B to the n, and the n's have to be the same for you to get this. So in other words, if you have 2 A's, you have to have 2 B's. If you have A, B, 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 B. So those are all good grammars in this. We can match this for A's and B's. We can match them for string length. We can match them in all the ways we want. But this is still provably something that the simplest class of grammars in this formal language hierarchy can't compute, because they can't keep track of the number of A's that have come before the number of B's. Okay? So these are 2 grammars that allows us to ask the question, matching all of the extraneous stuff, can animals go beyond this simplest sequential level? And the first work that I did, this was with Mark Hauser when I was at Harvard, we played these grammars to monkeys and to humans, and we then asked them to say whether a new string that they'd never heard before fits the grammar or not. And we found that for this simple sequential rule, the AB, AB, AB rule, both humans and monkeys are able to detect violations. So they're able to understand when a new string that they've never heard fits the grammar or violates the grammar. So we interpret that as the monkeys succeeding at learning this simple sequential grammar. Now, when we go to the hierarchical rule, where the number of A's and B's has to match, we find that humans, again, have no problem with this. You guys would learn this in about 3 minutes. And the monkeys, regardless of how much we expose them, regardless of what kinds of A's and B's we use, consistently failed to get this to distinguish between violations and correct or consistent strings. Now, the problem with this work, and it was criticized for being in the auditory domain. So one of the issues is maybe this is just a question about, can monkeys remember strings of sounds long enough to make the comparison? We know that monkeys can count up to 4, so there's no problem with the counting aspect of the A to the n, B to the n, but maybe they just don't remember. They have too short a memory. 5, okay, good. And so we've turned to a different paradigm using visual grammars and using different birds. We've worked with pigeons, which you all know, not the smartest birds, and these very clever birds named kias. And we do the same idea, the same 2 grammars, but now we do it in the visual domain so they can see the whole string at one moment in time. So there's no more working memory demand, or very light working memory demand, but we can, again, ask the same question. Because I'm running out of time, I'll go through this quickly. The pigeons, they get it, but they don't get it very well. They basically fail at most generalizations. The kias, on the other hand, these are very large-brained birds. They're very smart, and in our lab, they succeed on all kinds of tasks. They were able to do all kinds of generalizations, rotating new colors, getting rid of color entirely, et cetera, et cetera. But the crucial generalization, and they were also able to generalize to new lengths of strings, but the crucial thing that they weren't able to do was distinguish between 3 A's and 4 B's, or 2 A's and 3 B's. They were not able to exclude those. They didn't seem to be able to structure the string so that they could match these 2 sides. We gave them intensive training. They still failed. We also tried to ask, what were they doing? And I'm going to go through this quickly, but essentially we can use a way of asking for each individual bird, what is it that they learn? I mean, they succeeded at getting most of the answers right. What were they doing? And the key is, in all cases, basically came up with a very simple sequential rule that allowed them to get peanuts most of the time. We reward them with peanuts. But they didn't look at the whole string. So they basically either looked, does it start with 2 A's or does it end with 2 B's? Okay, and the pigeons just had all kinds of crazy stuff. They were completely variable. Let's not even think about the pigeons. Okay, so to me, this is much more convincing. We take a really smart bird, we get rid of the working memory constraints, and they still can't solve this seemingly trivial task that anyone in this room would find pretty much automatic, even with training. So what this leads us, this and a lot of other work that I don't have time to go into on many different species, is the conclusion that lots of animals can have a simple syntax. They can process strings in a serial way, but we're still the only species that has clear evidence of going beyond that and building up these tree structures that are crucial for human language. So this leads me to the end of my talk. I want to introduce the idea that one of the things that makes us special, that gives us syntax, really at the heart of human language, is what I call Philia. That's the love of trees. We humans are born with this capacity, not just a capacity, but a propensity to take data and build tree structures out of it. You don't have to teach kids to do this. This is part of the instinct to learn language. And as I told you, I mentioned music. This is not something we only apply to language. We also apply it to musical stimuli. We seem to apply it to these visual stimuli. And this requires computational abilities at this higher level, at the supraregular level in the Chomsky hierarchy. So what I want to end with is a hypothesis, a neural hypothesis about what's going on there. And the neurocomputational idea is that the region that enables us to go beyond these simple sequential rules is basically Broca's area via its connections with other areas. And you guys will all know about Paul Broca. When he discovered this region, he thought it was a speech region. But we now know that, in fact, Broca's plays a much more crucial role in syntactic processing. And the idea of this hypothesis is that what we've done is taken the basic machinery that any mammal has, and this is a computational model of that, where basically you take inputs, you step through states, and you can make an answer. We've added to that, and this is added via Broca's area and its connections, a stack that enables us to keep track of long-distance connections in any given string. And this is what Noam Chomsky called a push-down automaton. So what's the evidence that this is in Broca's area? Well, first of all, if we look at brain imaging, we find lots and lots, I mean, really scores of papers at this point consistent with the idea that Broca's region, the inferior frontal gyrus, is particularly interested in syntax. And this is just one which shows that whether you play real meaningful words or Jabberwocky, you get increased activation in Broca's area as syntactic complexity increases. And here's another study showing that the same thing happens in music. So musical syntax, if we make a musical syntactic violation, you also get activation of Broca's area on both the right and the left sides. So this is what leads me to say that Broca's area is playing a domain general, or at least a multi-domain role. Now, why do I think, so okay, fine, that's an area, that's just pointing at a particular part of the brain. But what we also know, if you do very careful cytoarchitectonic work of the sort that Katrin Amundsen told us about yesterday, this is work that Natalie Schenker was the first author on. If you analyze Broca's area, so area 44, we find that this is the most expanded area that we know of, that anyone has ever done the careful work, almost 7 times larger in the human than in a chimpanzee. Took a lot of work to do this in all these chimpanzees. And just because you might think, well, human brains are bigger anyway, if we look at V1, primary visual cortex, it's not even twice as big. So this is disproportionate to the overall increase of the brain, which is about 3 times, and more than we find in sensory systems. So that's part one. This area of the brain on both sides has expanded very much. Chimps have it, macaques have it. It's much bigger in us. It's also expanded in its connectivity. This is work by Jim Rilling using the methods of DTI that we heard a lot about yesterday. If you look in a monkey, this arcuate fasciculus that connects Broca's area to the temporal cortex basically isn't there. Chimps have a little bit more, but in human beings, it's this massive fiber bundle. There's a massive connection between Broca's region, inferior frontal gyrus, and the rest of the brain, particularly the temporal lobe. And that's why I really liked Rogier Mars's work yesterday. This is this graph, completely independent method, showing that the main region that the connectivity varies are these regions that are connected from Broca's area to the temporal and parietal cortex. So I think all of this data converges to the idea that Broca's region is playing a crucial role in allowing us to go beyond the simple sequential grammars that you see in other species. By expanding its size, but also by expanding its connection to other species, we get a capability building on what other animals have, but that goes beyond that. So good. So what I hope to have convinced you is that by looking at a wide variety of animals, not just chimpanzees or mice or macaques, but looking at birds and seals and all these different species on the planet, we can actually develop and test hypotheses about the biology and evolution of language. I hope I've convinced you that the determinants of speech are neural, not vocal anatomy. we're getting a clearer picture of what makes humans different. I know that there's some new data coming out that I can't talk about it because it's on embargo, showing that monkeys seem to be able to do superregularity in the motor domain, but not in the vocal or visual domain. So this, I think this story is going to keep developing. But what I want to end with is this idea that part of what makes us human is this dendrophilia that we're all born with, this desire to find hierarchical structures in the data that hits us. And thanks to all the people who helped me do this work, and thank you for your attention.
So, time for one quick question. Yossi, please go there already.
Thank you. I was wondering what you think about these cases of savage boys, which have been described in the literature.
Right.
Many, many cases, some of which are rather controversial because they might be mentally retarded. But in other cases, it looks as if the effect of having been deprived of language from the very beginning to when they've been found then leads to very severe disturbances in language, particularly in syntax. And the reason for my interest in that is that it is clear in other systems that if certain connections are not used in early life,
they die away.
They disappear.
Yep. This wild child thing, there's so few data points to work on that I think we really can't say. I mean, I think the data is consistent with the idea that if you're not exposed to language early on within the first 10 years, you're never going to get full language. I think we have a lot of data that argues for that. We have examples like Kaspar Hauser, who apparently did learn pretty good German, and then we have examples more recently like Jeannie, who basically never got language. So I think we have so few data that I think it's very hard to say from them. But if you look at normal children, if they're not exposed, for example, deaf children who aren't exposed to sign language early, they never really develop it. And I think that's all consistent with the idea if you don't use it, you lose it. And it's pruned away if you aren't using these connections.